So it is my pleasure to introduce the session chair. John Mathieson is the Vice President, Power and New Energy Americas at Envisioning. He leads the Power Independent Consulting arm of the Worley Parsons Group, providing technical, advisory, and consulting services to clients in the energy and resources sector. He has 20 years' experience working both internationally and in the US and Canada with expertise in traditional fossil fuel technologies, renewables, and more recently, microgrids, energy storage, and distributed generation.
Thanks, Adrian. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what might end up being the most interesting session of the day and possibly the most controversial as well. As Adrian mentioned, my name is John Mathieson, and I lead our Power and New Energy team, focusing on advisory and strategic and technical advisory services. So disruptive energy technologies are already occurring in where we work, live, and play, and the speed of these disruptions is increasing as time goes on. If we specifically look at the confluence of the energy and mining sectors in particular, we've seen a few trends that our clients are experiencing. So I'd just like to spend a couple of moments talking about 4 of those trends. The first is that more and more mining clients are embracing renewable energy and energy storage in various hybrid systems. And one particular example that comes to mind is a project that we were looking at in Chile, where they're integrating both solar thermal power as well as solar photovoltaic power into a gas hybrid system to look at, to provide both electrical power and thermal process heat into the Chilean mine. We're seeing other examples, of course, of wind and energy storage being integrated, but even biomass technologies at some mines in Guyana. The second trend that we're seeing, and we've heard a lot about today, is around the global push towards lower greenhouse gas emissions. And one project, again, that we've been working on is for BHP Billiton. We've helped them identify their global GHG footprint across their entire business, so from petroleum through their mining industries, potash, and all of it. And this assessment has led to some discussions about some alternate generation technologies at a variety of their sites globally. And the actions coming out of this session will be feeding into their 5-year GHG commitment plan that leads up until fiscal 2022. The third trend that we're seeing is that there's greater challenges to achieving social license to develop and operate mines and their associated processing facilities. To overcome this, we're seeing miners work closer with communities, First Nations, and other key local stakeholders. And to the point that these relationships are actually creating more opportunities than may have been originally foreseen when the discussions began. In fact, many indigenous groups believe that energy should actually come from the sun and the wind, and the more of these types of renewables you can integrate into their communities, the more it aligns with their own cultural and historical beliefs. The fourth trend we're seeing is around getting more out of less. Effectively, this comes down to a lot of the debottlenecking activities that take place in mines, as well as numerous energy efficiency audits taking place and the resulted actions coming out of those audits. Looking at things such as waste heat recovery and just general energy optimization. And actually, we heard earlier today, I'm going to paraphrase a quote, that the cheapest megawatt hour is actually the one that's not needed. So some of these trends we're going to hear about in more detail from our panelists at the TED Talks just now. So I don't know if we want to invite all the panelists up. We can invite all the panelists to come up and have a seat while I just introduce what a TED Talk is. So what is TED Talks? For those of you unfamiliar with them, TED Talks are short, well-formed, and compelling presentations. And they are short intentionally so that they capture your attention and don't let your attention focus on perhaps the networking drink session occurring after this. They're intended to talk about something that's a little bit different from what you might expect, or to hear a compelling twist on a basic idea that you're already familiar with, that lets you look at things in a new perspective. So no pressure to our speakers as we go through some well-formed presentations here. Now, today, the question that we're actually here to ponder is, what does the energy mix of the mine of the future look like? And the intent is to look far into the future and envision what energy mines might look like. If you take some of the trends that we're seeing today and you project those 10, 20, 30 plus years into the future, what will that look like? However, to achieve that future mix, there are barriers and steps that must be steps required along the way to overcome those barriers. So we will hear from 5 mining leaders about where they would like to see the energy mix of the future. And we'll also hear about how some of these barriers have actually created opportunities for them. Following the presentation, the audience will be able to challenge and question some of the ideas that they're putting forward. So as you're listening to these presentations, think up some really good questions for them. So to begin, I'd like to introduce Robin Goad from Fortune Minerals. Robin's 30 years of experience in mining and mineral exploration has taken him to some rather remote and northern locations over the years, where I'd imagine he's come to understand the challenges of limited available infrastructure, such as power. Robin's current project is the development of a vertically integrated producer of cobalt, gold, bismuth, and copper. And as we heard earlier today, cobalt is a particularly interesting element for lithium-ion batteries. So with that, Robin.
Thank you for the introduction, John. I'm going to be talking about a lot of diverse subjects today because we've got a bit of an interesting project that's a contributor to the value chain of renewable energy as a near-term cobalt producer, but also a project it's vertically integrated, so it's comprised of a mine and a concentrator up in Canada's Northwest Territories, which has some very unique energy challenges associated with it. And then we actually have a refinery which we're going to construct in Saskatoon, and we relocated that refinery to Saskatoon primarily because of the energy issues. Power in the Northwest Territories is very scarce, it's expensive, typically anywhere from 15 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas when we decided to relocate the refinery to Saskatoon, we were looking at 5.6 cents a kilowatt hour. It's currently 7 cents per kilowatt hour for the refinery today. So we have about a 10 megawatt demand load for each site, 6.9 cent running load, 6.9 megawatt running load in the Northwest Territories, and 7 megawatts in Saskatoon. So the first part I'm going to talk about is batteries, and right now the world is in the midst of a remarkable disruptive transformation with automotive electrification. And the main target for our project is to actually produce a cobalt sulfate heptahydrate, which is the raw material which goes into the cathodes of most lithium-ion batteries. So we're very much plugged into to this opportunity. And we're seeing battery costs declining very, very quickly. We talked about why isn't the mining industry reacting more quickly. Well, the costs are coming down so quickly. It's really quite incredible. So battery costs about a decade ago were $1,200 per kilowatt hour. Today, about $135 per kilowatt hour. So what does that do to the cost of energy for an electric car, for example? Well, we're approaching cost parity right now with a gasoline combustion engine or an internal combustion engine. And in fact, an electric car can now have an effective range the same as a gasoline-powered car. At the same time, we're also seeing governments announcing future bans on cars with internal combustion engines, banning coal in the production of electricity, certainly in this country. So very significant disruptive technology in what's happening in batteries. So how does that relate to the mining industry is quite interesting. We've been through a period of where mine fleets have been electrified through electric-assisted trucks over the last decade. We heard today the Borden mine is going to be the first underground fully electric mine, and I was very fortunate to go up to McLean Engineering in Collingwood and seeing the Borden fleet coming off the assembly line. And it's the advantages to having electric was already outlined in the Goldcorp presentation earlier today, but basically 3 times the efficiency, but a huge savings in ventilation, which is important not only for operating costs, but also for capital and the expense for developing the ventilation equipment or ventilation network. In addition, what we haven't talked a lot about today is how higher power, affordable lithium-ion batteries also have a role in stationary storage. And they have 2 significant ways they contribute to stationary storage. One, they enable renewable energy options like solar and wind to be used as grid baseload, because if you haven't got wind or sun, then you need some kind of energy backup system, and basically those batteries provide that. But they also provide an opportunity for making the grids more efficient. And a great example of that is the Hawaiian island of Kauai, which is now completely running on solar power, but it has a 53 megawatt Tesla battery backup system. And that allows, obviously, for backup power when that solar energy isn't available. And something that's a little bit interesting is that the batteries that are being used in grid storage are effectively the same batteries that are used in the automobiles. So after the useful life of an automobile battery is consumed, those batteries will actually have 80% of their useful life available and will have a secondary role in grid storage. It's very interesting also about efficiencies in the grid. About 85% of power demand is generated and consumed in just 15% of the day. So power supply must be designed and built to accommodate peak demands or supplemented by natural gas or diesel-powered peakers. California Edison just recently installed two 80 megawatt backup systems, basically to eliminate natural gas peakers. And Tesla, you've probably heard this week, has just announced that they've completed the largest grid storage backup system for the South Australia grid. It's 100 megawatts, and this basically allows greater efficiencies in the grid. And we can apply that same concept to a mining project as well, because, for example, our projects each have about 10 megawatts of demand load, but about 7 megawatts in running load. So if you can actually create or store that power in a battery backup system, then perhaps we don't have to design the demand load systems to the same extent. So that essentially is the first part of my talk, just how batteries can play a role in energy. The other things that we're going to talk about today is the two sites that we have and the very unique issues that we have of building a mine up in the Northwest Territories, as well as a refinery in Saskatoon. And the ideal energy supply is simply to connect to a nearby grid where power is supplied with a balanced, reliable, and cost-effective energy supply. And that was very instrumental in us relocating the refinery to Saskatoon, where we have those conditions in 7 kilowatt hour power. However, Canada's northern territories are very different. They're suffering from an acute infrastructure deficit, the lack of nearby energy and transportation systems. Northern territories are high cost, remote, harsh, dark. I'm quite envious about all the solar opportunities that I've heard today, but unfortunately we don't have that same natural asset up in the Northwest Territories. Also, we have long supply chains, very significant trucking distances that are sometimes open for about 2 to 3 months of the year with winter ice roads. These impact the kinds of choices that are available for us in remote mining. It's also important to recognize that remote mines in Canada's north must supply their own infrastructure, increasing the capital and operating costs and raising the threshold for economic viability. We must engineer, bond, construct, operate, and then decommission our own infrastructure comprised of airstrips, winter ice roads, power supply and distribution, camps to accommodate workers, additional fuel tankage and warehousing to accommodate a year's inventory of bulk consumables, as well as we have to pay for additional cost to fly people and goods and services into the site for work rotations. Presently, hydrocarbon-based systems are currently the most efficient source of energy for these kinds of remote places. The landscape is changing, and it's changing really quickly, and we heard a lot more about that today. Diesel is a very versatile fuel. It has the highest, most practical energy availability for weight, for transporting that fuel up to remote locations like the territories. It also has commonality with the fuel that's used in our mobile equipment, so obviously you want to try and maintain practical storage facilities. And the generators are equipped with efficient heat recovery systems to capture and utilize waste heat. And the cost of that waste heat is about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So diesel plants up in the Northwest Territories would cost about $1 million per megawatt. and typically deliver energy at about 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on the supply chain distances. Natural gas is becoming a really interesting fuel opportunity for remote locations, and that's simply because there's a lot of stranded gas in Canada, and the fuel price is very cheap. But it's also a very inefficient fuel to be transporting to northern locations with long supply chains. So the best way to deal with that is to go for a higher density gas, which is LNG. But LNG has to have cryogenic storage, cryogenic transportation, and it's also has to have 12-month road access because the fuel dissipates over time. So this is a very unique opportunity to reduce your cost of energy at probably about 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour in a remote location like this. The Diavik Diamond Mine recently installed 9.2 megawatts of wind power up in the Northwest Territories. They've been able to eliminate 10% of their carbon emissions and, reduce their diesel by 10% and carbon emissions by 6%. Unfortunately, these systems are not quite as effective as diesel at this time, but wind and solar renewable options are declining in price, and I expect that they will, as time goes on, become as cheap as carbon-based fuels. Our particular project in the Northwest Territory is quite interesting. It's only 22 kilometers from the Snare hydroelectric system. There are 4 hydro dams there, but regrettably insufficient power. Am I over time? I'm sorry, I have a bad habit of doing that. Anyways, where we're going with this is we've decided to work with the Northwest Territories Power Corporation on an LNG fuel supply for the project. That's because we do have road access, but we won't have road access during operations, so we have to use diesel, unfortunately, during construction. And that's just to meet with the construction schedule. I was going to talk about some other options. We'll probably get into those later on in the presentation. Just want to make a quick comment about carbon taxes. Highly punitive for projects like ours in the Northwest Territories, where you don't have a lot of options. We've done trade-off studies comparing the cost of hooking up to the electrical grid using LNG and using diesel power. They cost our project $2, $3, and $5 million respectively. So no matter what fuel type we use, it's highly punitive. And very difficult for places like the Northwest Territories to be able to compete with southern jurisdictions. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I'm sorry if I went over a lot.
Next up, we have Sunil Kumar from Kinross Gold. Sunil is the Director of Energy at Kinross, based in Toronto, and has corporate responsibility for the company's energy portfolio. His 30 years experience encompasses renewables and conventional energy projects from early conceptual design stages through to full project delivery. Please welcome Sunil. And I'm also going to ask you to walk around 10 times. Thank you.
Is this microphone working? There we go. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, John, for the opportunity to be here. I've been participating in this conference for a number of years. And it's great to see the growth in the number of people that's here from the first year that the conference took place. I think it's showing that renewables going from kind of a fringe technology to something that's more mainstream these days, and you can definitely see that with the projects. Can I have the first slide, please? There's just one slide I'm going to use here. Yes, this is just to give you a little bit of context as to Kinross and who we are. It rings my microphone okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. To move this back and forth here. So just a little bit of context in terms of Kinross and who we are. We're one of the largest gold producers in the world, and this map shows you the regions in which we operate. So we have operations in West Africa, in Mauritania, and Ghana, in Americas, both in the US as well as down in Brazil, and also some operations in Chile, and also in Russia as well. So you can see quite a wide variety of locations based in geography. In some of the places that are quite remote, such as in Russia and Mauritania, we actually generate our own power. So a large variety of energy sources that we work with at all of our sites. Total globally, we spend about $350 to $400 million in energy costs. That includes both fuel and purchased power, depending on how much production we have and what the price of oil is in that particular year. So the theme of today's conference is what is the ideal mix for power and energy? And the simple answer is there is no one simple answer for that. Again, if you look at all of our different operations, they're so vastly different. In Brazil, for example, hydroelectric power is a key part of the mix down there. But obviously, you don't have that in Mauritania. So again, each region is different. So really what you have to look at is what is it that defines what is the ideal mix for the energy. So some of the things that we look at, first of all, of course, is what is the type of fuels that are available in that particular area in which you're operating. Is natural gas available? Is it hydroelectric? Is it solar? Is it wind? Fuel oil? What is it that's available and reliably available? Second is on cost, and this, I mean both the initial capital cost, but also the life cycle cost. We would take both into account as well. There's all the environmental issues about being able to get something permitted, what's the carbon footprint, what's the availability of the fuel, and this is extremely important. What is the actual reliability of that energy source as well? Because we're an operating facility, we have to be sure that the energy source is going to be very, very reliable. And it's extremely important when we do the evaluations in our energy strategy that we look at all of those different aspects. In the mining sector, typically we're not innovators in terms of adapting technology or developing technologies. Quite often, it's imported over from other sectors. Once it becomes mainstream there, then it moves into mining, and you see that as well in the energy side as well. But as time goes on, you'll see more and more technologies which are well proven in other sectors starting to come more and more into mining. If you look at mines of the future, well, what's going to be happening? A lot of them are going to be even more remote than what they are right now, which means more infrastructure requirements need to be built, which would include power lines as well, or how do you power those particular facilities? If we then start looking specifically at what are the specific technologies that could be adopted, so I'm going to use a stage as a bit of a timeline. So imagine where I'm standing now is where we are today, and in that direction is kind of the future. So where we are today, what are the things that are happening? We've talked about energy management, so things such as advanced process controls, which reduce your energy consumption is important. We're starting to see the onset of renewables into the energy sector, but limited up to now. And then also other advanced process controls such as ore sorting, that's going to come in, which again, it reduces the amount of energy that you use. So that's kind of where we are right now. If I move a little bit further along in time, these are things that are not too far in the future, but we can see them happening. And some of these we're already talking about today. So these would be things such as battery technologies that are coming in. Huge potential for this, not just for power generation, but also in mining vehicles as well. And it's interesting, one of the utilities that serves us, they actually put in I think it's about a 40 megawatt battery system about 15 years ago. It's kind of state-of-the-art technology demonstration, and it's interesting to see how the technology is becoming more and more mainstream right now. So battery technologies are big, and what it'll also do is, of course, increase the penetration rate of solar, such as solar and wind, into the facilities as well. So it's continuing on my journey here. If I go a little bit further along, obviously, we've talked about electrical vehicles and autonomous vehicles as well. That we're starting to see some of that happen, but I think that's going to have a huge, huge impact on the energy mix. You think about in the mining sector, how much fuel oil is being used in haul trucks. If a good chunk of that can go to electric, that's going to have a huge impact. You're already starting to see some of the major equipment vendors have technologies in that area and doing large-scale tests. Now, if I look a bit further out, and maybe not beyond the stage, but at the edge of the stage in terms of the timeline, and again, remembering these are just predictions, and I'm reminded of a prediction that was made by a very famous executive back in 1943, who said at that time that he believed the world only had enough market for 5 computers to be put in. So this was back in 1943. And the person who said that was the CEO of IBM at that time. IBM at that time was only making recorders and clocks and things like that, so you can see how people make estimates and judgments and how wrong they can be. So before you throw me out in terms of last recommendation, suggestion I'm going to make, just kind of keep that in mind. And what I'd like to throw out to you is, in all of mining, we use physical processes where we're basically blasting and then you're grinding to make the material, using pyrometallurgy, you're using other metallurgical processes, hydrometallurgical processes. But there's no biology into any of this. In some recent discussions with some university folks, they're actually doing research on biological processing of ore. So imagine what that would do. Instead of having fuel or electricity, you've actually got biological processing of ore, which would really reduce the amount of energy. So again, not for all types of ore, but maybe there's a segment of ore processing where this could happen. And the other interesting part that it's happening in is with respect to actual energy. There's interesting biological processes, such as algae processing, that are another form of energy. So what happens here is people take CO2 exhaust gas out of the stream, you put LED light with it, and it grows algae, which can either be used as a fuel oil or it can be used to make power. So imagine what that can do and really change the energy mix. And there's actually some very interesting research work going on in Ontario in that particular area. So those are some ideas in terms of where we are today to where we might be in the future. John.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunil. Next up, we have John Lyons from Erdene Resources Development. John leads the company's strategy, HSE, and stakeholder engagement activities. While his company is focused on the exploration of base metals in southern Mongolia, he's also driven to ensure that broader stakeholders in the area can jointly benefit from such a development. John, I learned, arrived in Mongolia as an undergraduate student, stepping off a bus one day without anyone there to meet him, and has been back and forth many times in the last 15 years. So please welcome John. No, not yet.
We're better there. I must contend.
Oh, there we go. Good.
There it is.
Oh, there.
Can you hear that okay?
Yep.
Hello again. Thank you for that kind introduction, John. And Sambatskano to any of our Mongolian colleagues who are able to join us. There's a small community here in Toronto. I apologize for having my backs to you, but that's the way it works out today. So I began my career in banking, specifically in microfinance, which is banking for the unbanked, which at the time was a somewhat controversial idea, but has basically been mainstream now that it's been shown to be profitable throughout the financial services world. And perhaps that's not unlike the journey that renewables has undertaken in the energy business and in mining in particular. When I worked in microfinance in Mongolia, it was about working mostly with farmers, retired bureaucrats, and young people to try their hand at the market at running a private business. And it wasn't long before I realized how influential mining was on the market. Now, mining in Mongolia at that time, and even today, it's mostly small alluvial gold producers. Maybe a few commercial projects here and there. And since then, I've mostly worked on the greenfields, brownfields, exploration and development side. As John suggested, thinking about health, safety, environmental management, and stakeholder engagement issues, but also on the financing and investment side. As you can imagine, in developing country jurisdictions, there's a great deal of interest, but also a high level of perceived risk. Erdene Resource Development is perhaps unique in the junior mining company space. We have been active in Mongolia basically since private investment was allowed into the country, and they put a legal framework in place for that following the collapse of the socialist regime. And through good times and bad, as many of our industry observers will likely note, we've plugged away methodically. That's resulted in the identification of gold and polymetallic resources in country that will become the next generation of mines that will be developed into mines. And we are plodding along to do that ourselves, in part because the risk perception in Mongolia, or of Mongolia, remains relatively high. A bit of context, it's perhaps an exotic sounding word, but what the hell is Mongolia? It's roughly 3 million people on China's doorstep with a tremendous geology. Anyone who's looked at a solar irradiance map here of our energy friends will note the Gobi Desert's potential, albeit untapped and largely undeveloped. And being on China's footstep has made the prospect of selling metals and minerals a fairly attractive one that's driven Mongolia's prosperity in the last decade. But poverty remains high and political instability is no joke. I've worked with 5 mining ministers in the last 3 years, but we've been able to get things done and continue to do so. I like this concept of leapfrogging. Governments like to talk about it. It's a bit buzzy. But it really is the case that the mines that will develop in places like Mongolia don't have to be beholden to carbon-intensive energy and to other processes that our developed jurisdictions have perhaps locked into. Now, these are new technologies for us here, and you can imagine they're that much newer in a remote, rural location on the outskirts of civilization, perhaps, at least from our perspective. To me, the opportunity to leapfrog in the energy space is, well, it's inextricably linked with our efforts around local economic development, local content, water resource management, and mine planning. The first question out the door on any of our projects is always, what's the environmental impact and where are the jobs? Perhaps you can all relate to that. And while renewable energy is not going to offset the need to dig a hole in the ground or construct a shaft, it for us at least, signals the approach and willingness to address our impacts in ways that maybe aren't immediately obvious. I think the rationale for building a mine of the future that is, well, at least on some level supplied by renewables, is obviously a question of efficiency and cost, but the skills and knowledge transfer associated with this new technology is something that has meaningful and long-lasting impact for the societies within which we operate, not unlike the environmental conservation approach that B2 Gold that Mark shared with us earlier today. So, when we hear questions, like I'm sure we all have on an almost weekly basis about, well, at least for me, you don't even know if you have a mine yet. Why are you talking about renewables? Or it's just too complex. What's, hybrid grid? Let's just go with what we know. To me, confronting those questions and that perception is, it's a tremendous value-creating opportunity, not just in terms of efficiency and reducing costs, but in reducing political risk, reducing the risk of local shutdown, political risk, but also in just retaining and attracting talent. Every engineer and administrator and corporate development person in our company gets, really excited about the prospect of powering a mine from renewables. I'm sure you've felt this as well. And I'd go as far to contend that juniors in this space have a great deal to contribute and perhaps the greatest responsibility. We're very often the first boots on the ground in country around these future mine sites, at least where they exist in the greenfield setting, as my colleague suggested, further and further away from existing infrastructure. So I think this end game of lower cost energy and more efficient operations, plus the mining's contribution to local economic development or sustainable development can only happen if we bake these ideas into our project cycle early. And what's that look like? I'm not able to commission yet full feasibility level technical studies of renewable energy, a system for a mine whose specifications I'm not yet deeply familiar with, but I can look at feasibility. I can understand my host government's commitments to the Paris Agreement. For Erdene resource development, this is, consideration of renewables in the early life cycle have really made us comfortable with the costs, constraints, and potential benefit. And I believe that embracing renewables really does and will drive a culture of excellence. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next up, we have Steve Letwin from IM Gold. From his over 35 years of experience in the highly competitive resources sector, Steve has always had energy on the forefront of his mind. Since his experiences working at Dome Petroleum, he's also recognized the importance of embracing innovation, both in technology and in managing the company's cost structures. Steve's company is currently building its second solar power plant, following, which actually we heard about previous session, the 15 megawatt unit.
That's right, yeah.
Confusing the two. Following their first 5 megawatt solar farm that's operating in Suriname. And this year, Steve was ranked #1 on Financial Post's CEO 100 list. Please welcome Steve.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. And I've got one slide as well. And so I got together with, I don't know if Tony Moreau's in the room, but I wanted to try and express, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so we drew this picture of what I thought a mine would look like in the future. And what this mine looks like to me is that it's completely integrated. You'll see on your far right side, a satellite communication system that is very necessary when you're in a remote area to give you information to the drones that will transmit information to driverless trucks, that will in turn help your mucker, that will in turn help your mill, and that's driven by your solar or wind. And I believe that our energy needs are going to be 100% met in the future by renewables. There's no question in my mind. Next year, US and China are going to invest $150 billion in renewable energy. What's the one thing missing from the picture? Anybody tell me? People. And one of the questions was, what's the biggest non-economic challenge to the mine of the future? It's jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. In Africa, the first thing the government will ask us, how many jobs are we going to create? How many people in the community are going to be employed? So this is a very compelling diagram, because yes, it will bring costs down. Yes, it is the future. There's no doubt. How much cash does Tesla burn in one day? 16 million. If I ran my company like that, I wouldn't be standing up here. But Elon Musk gets away with it. Why? Because he's not a car company. He's a tech company. And he's building for the future. And mining is going to have to go that way, ladies and gentlemen. In order for us to compete, we're going to have to become much more technologically driven and much more driven in the energy side than we've ever been in the past. And it will come. But the biggest challenge we have is dealing with the people. Because the people are what has made our companies so successful, and they will be there in the future. It'll be a different kind of knowledge, it'll be a different kind of training. And we need to start dealing with it now. We need to start training people to deal with the mine of the future. And that mine that we've drawn on that slide is not that far away. We have 2,000 people working in Essakane. We have 2,000 people working in Suriname. And whether it's an open pit mine like this or an underground mine like at Westwood, it doesn't matter. They're jobs, and people depend on those jobs. So if I had any message for you today, it would be this. Technology is coming, improvements coming, renewables will drive our future without a doubt. The one thing we need to start working on today, perhaps yesterday, is training and developing our people for these changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Last up, we have Bill Alleman from Anglo Gold Ashanti. Bill has over 25 years of experience in corporate and consulting roles. His areas of core competence, among many others, includes sustainability strategy implementation. He is a proponent of improving the demand-side drivers at mines and has considered renewables and energy storage at several sites, both greenfield and brownfield. Please welcome Bill.
Great, thank you, John. I see how this is working. Have the American go last, cut him short, and give him the broken chair, okay? I didn't vote for the guy, okay? And I don't use Twitter, so. In preparation for this session, I was talking to John, and I said, hey, I'm happy to participate. I just wasn't sure what we could contribute, because there was a comment earlier this afternoon about, why aren't miners adopting more renewables and such. And for us, it's been a bit of a challenge in that we have operations in Brazil, and half of our load is supplied by our own hydroelectric plant, and the rest is from the grid, which is hydro. We're in Argentina, we're right next to a natural gas field. In Australia, we have a take-or-pay on a new natural gas line. South Africa has its own unique business challenges right now, so there really isn't an appetite for much investment. And then when we look across continental Africa, we have a number of challenges ranging from political to space constraints and so on. So it's really been frustrating from my side as far as, we really want to get involved in this, as well as, the sustainability folks and such at our company. But as I shared that with John, I was mentioning a unique challenge, I guess, that we're working on, and that is in where we have two mines. There's an established national grid, but there's always a challenge. Probably half of the generation is hydroelectric. During the last drought, the hydro production came way down. In the tropical belt, if you're not aware, there's a 10-year cycle, rain cycle. And the problem is each 10-year low gets lower each decade. So it's not getting better. Through poor planning in the last drought, the thermal generation was not prepared. There wasn't enough maintenance done. Everyone was scrambling to bring in power barges. Then came the challenge of trying to get the feedstock for the thermal plants. And the country got into credit issues and this and that and so on. So another issue that we have there is interruptions on the grid, and sometimes that's just from human error. We find out that we got kicked offline, or like what happened, was it a fault? Or, no, someone did something wrong in dispatch and dropped us off the load. So, we're interested in renewables really for that energy mix in the short term to help control our own destiny, to help hedge costs, to make sure that we've got the reliability that we need. A bit of a challenge because you still want to have that connection to the grid, so there's portions of that tariff that you have to continue to pay. But we don't have a final solution yet. We're working with down a few avenues actually with supplier partners, including not just a renewables or a hybrid island mode solution, but also with the utility of, do we go maybe to a higher voltage? Do we allow them to put a peaker plant on our location and so on? Along with the natural challenges of life of mine and all that, which seems like every 6 months or so it's heading in a different direction, but yet, as we talk internally in our company, some of these mines have had 5-year life of mine plans for the last 80 years. So, let's look at some of these solutions. I'm hearing a lot about the more modular solutions, which are very interesting. Stepping into a hybrid plant. We have a new 40 megawatt plant going in Gaeta, Tanzania. That right now Tanzania's government has turned a bit hostile to the mining industry. We see ourselves continuing. However, I'm sure that storm will pass, and then we'll be interested in, what things can we add, other features can we add to that plant. And one item that I picked up during this conference that I didn't realize is obviously we're all interested in batteries, but when I think batteries, I'm thinking, hybrid solutions, solar, and so on. And I heard a great comment today that about eliminating that spinning reserve by using energy storage. So, short-term batteries, long-term nuclear, if our sustainability folks our stakeholders can handle that. But short-term, we've got a number of unique solutions, and John thought that might be great to share. So, thank you.
So there you have it. We've heard from 5 different experts in the industry. Heard everything from storage, bioalgae, robots and automation, modular systems, and nuclear. At this point, we're going to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So hopefully you've been thinking of some cool doozies for them. If Adrian, there you go. Just one right at the back.
Thanks. 2 linked questions. Basically, we've now, and thank you, because this was all very interesting, and all obviously from an industry perspective. And I was curious, if you had to ask one thing from governments in the countries where you operate, this is linked to my presentation this morning, that would help you facilitate realizing those projections for the future you just made, what would it be? What changes would you need from the government side? And also, what opportunity do you see for all of you and everybody here to actually collaborate? Because these are all, again, individual attempts and innovation. Do you see opportunities for the business to actually collaborate to realize these futures you've been predicting? Thank you.
Anyone in particular want to say that? Robin?
Sorry, no shortage of energy up here, and blinding lights up here. From my perspective, operating up in the Canadian Arctic is infrastructure. Unfortunately, I know that the focus is on renewable energy in this conference, but it's infrastructure is such a big deal in the mining industry in the Arctic. We get basically access to energy systems, transportation systems, our costs are down.
Yeah, I would say, to your first question about what we could get from the government, I would just say reinvestment in education, training, development. The more we're mining in remote areas, like Africa, West Africa, in the sense that we're far away, in our case, Essakane is 400 kilometers north of the major city of Ouagadougou. Unemployment is very, very high already. So as we move down the road of automation, renewables, robots, artificial intelligence, an already high unemployment rate is going to get higher. Couple that with the fact that the population is going to double in the next 20 years, and you have some real social challenges. And don't think for a minute that's not going to affect us in North America. Don't think for a minute. And it's a big problem, and I see it every time I'm over there. So governments need to start recognizing, number one, the population issues need to be addressed in some form or fashion, and we're going to have massive issues in Africa. 1 billion more people added to that continent in the next 25 years. Very resource rich, where a lot of mining is occurring. Number two, we need to reinvest, get people trained. And if you want to read a good book, read Hillbilly Elegy. It talks about Mid-America and why people in Mid-America voted for Trump. They voted for Trump because they're looking for jobs. And the answer for jobs is education, training, development.
Just to add to the first question about what governments can do, obviously there's a lot of things related to stability in terms of government policy and mining licenses and all that. But one of the other aspects that emphasizes quite often the government controls the electrical infrastructure. The utilities may be an offshoot of the government, and the reliability of some of those utilities is really significant issue for us in certain areas. So that's an area where we've had discussions with the utilities and the governments of trying to make that stronger, and that's very important because if you're having power trips like every day, the productivity really goes down. I think Bill knows what I'm talking about.
The only thing else that I can add is, what I'd like to add is on the collaboration. I came out of the automotive industry. I was at Ford Motor Company for 21 years and went into consulting and ran back into heavy industry. But in automotive, there's a great deal of collaboration on the energy side. It's sometimes mediated by the Department of Energy or the EPA. But, you know, we're talking about infrastructure and such. There isn't really anything, you know, secretive or, you know, that we have to keep to ourselves. So I would like to see, you know, maybe as this forum expands, to have some workshops or such, and maybe for the corporate energy managers to get together. So that would be fantastic.
Kirsten, was it? Or Kirsten. Just to add 2 points. They could stop subsidizing the energy business. That would be helpful in the jurisdictions within which I work. And on the collaboration side, just to put a plug in for trade associations, we found them to be the most neutral, convening party for getting the companies and the government at the same table. Thanks.
Any more questions?
To check my dexterity in the afternoon here for the networking drinks. Tim Hoy with Clean Energy Consulting. There's been a little bit of talk about biomass, but it seems like when we're talking about job creation, particularly in the, 2 to 8 megawatt size range with some of the biomass technology that's out there now, the operating costs are similar or less than diesel, and then you create a bunch of employment, skilled employment, and some ongoing labor around that. Can you speak at all about the role that you see for biomass in this mining of the future energy mix?
Well, actually, it sounds like a great idea and a great opportunity, because what jumps into my mind is we have a number of farming programs going on in Gita, Tanzania. Yeah, as soon as you say bio, I'm thinking, you know, what are they doing with the waste? Hopefully they're not burning it, right? So that's a great idea. Thank you. I think that's something that we'll pursue.
I might add that it is an opportunity for places like the Northwest Territories where you actually do have wood. It's considered renewable energy, so it's not subject to carbon tax, and obviously it provides for heat as well, which is waste heat capture is something that's very important in operating in the north.
Yeah, same with biomass. It's also very region-specific as well as to what can be done. Obviously, in parts of Africa, depending where the desert obviously doesn't apply. We're in Brazil as well, and we're seeing Brazil in general. There's a lot of biomass, growth there. Agriculture is a big business in Brazil, so a lot of generators related to that.
Okay, thanks. More questions?
Got it. We talked a lot about, Greg Farthing at ABB, we talked a lot about technology today, the opportunities, mining industry really looking and focusing on renewables and reducing greenhouse gases. But when you look at the technology, you look at the size of the challenge to integrate all this technology, how are you approaching it now? Some of you have actually built some projects, but are you looking at it in phases where you start with a pilot project, you learn the technology, and then you phase and grow the project as you get comfortable with the technology and you're convinced of the reliability? Because a lot of technology is pretty proven technology, but you have people that you're going to have to convince and train to be able to operate these systems. So I'm just curious, how do you approach a project and how do you grow?
Well, I think for us, on the underground side, it's driven by safety, and safety is a big catalyst for us in terms of technology, and as our mines seem to be going deeper because grades are getting lower and costs are getting higher, robotic help is driving a lot of our future, and that's driven around safety particularly. And then I would say on the open pit side, again, it's driven by companies like yourself that come in with, I would say, catalysts and changes that really help us move ahead. So while our mine sites are very innovative and are very thoughtful about where they want to go, we are getting a lot of help from outside the site, from technological companies, people involved in creating robotic help, for example, driverless trucks. In the mine that we're looking at, Cote as an example, which is a joint venture with Sumitomo, a $1 billion operation, or between Sudbury and Timmins, will be a mine of the future. It will be an electrified mine. And that's where we're getting lots of new ideas and opportunities to do it. We don't have labor issues to deal with. We have a clean sheet of paper, and that's where we can make a lot of progress, because the people issues, at least for now, are not there.
I might just touch on the issue of risks. Our project is the capital cost is being re-estimated because we're having a 30% increase in production rate. But a $700, $800 million project, you obviously have to be very cognizant of technology risks, and whatever energy system you put in place has to be proven, or you have additional risks and greater cost of money, because your debt facility is based on risk.
As we evaluate projects and technologies, a lot comes back to what stage is the technology at. So let's say if we're looking at a solar project 3 years ago, we probably would have gone with a smaller scale because uncertainty. Nowadays, as we're evaluating, we're quite comfortable with if we go into the decision for a fairly large scale, because technology is proven. We see a lot of examples. But when it gets into it, again, solar is a good example, is what's the maximum penetration rate of solar you can have in a system that's island system where you're not connected to the grid. And that's where there's interesting work to be done, where the batteries fit in. So a place like that, I can see where we do like a phase one, which would be, let's call it a medium scale penetration, see how that goes, and maybe a phase two later on is a higher penetration, you put in batteries. And that's one of the good things with the battery and the renewable systems. They are somewhat modular, that you can have an existing system and you can plug them in later on just to kind of displace more and more fuel oil.
From our perspective, where again the opportunities are challenging, I'm reminding our teams that, hey, you know, installing a small system is fine too. Again, I'm thinking back to my automotive days where when I was at Ford would do something, you know, fairly substantial, and then be too humble to really talk about it for fear of greenwashing. Yet another competitor would do a small project and market the heck out of it. Not that we need to do that, however, you know, where there's a need for renewables, it doesn't mean we need to put in 1,000 hectares of PV. We have remote bore fields. It could be street lighting, it could be car parks. I mean, there's a lot of different packaged systems. And another approach is maybe we put in a megawatt at a time in some type of modular system. When I talk to our finance folks, they say, hey, they're not too concerned about a PPA that is 10, 15, 20 years, as long as there's that defined scale of what the cost is to exit that PPA. The question more is, do we want to incur the cost of borrowing money? Maybe we should wait until we're healthier a year from now or so, then we'll use our own green dollars. So there's some financial decisions, and then again, smaller systems might be a great entree.
Look, somewhat contentiously, I believe it's the responsibility of any new project to push the needle, right? And that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Where I'm at, there's literally no commercial mine yet. So that could be simply having a renewable hybrid power baseload for the first mine that sets the tone for that district. And moving forward, you add on incrementally and others surpass this. But it's really about, I think as Steve mentioned, where your new projects have the opportunity to push the needle.
Time for one more question. These lights are strong. Back there.
Thanks. Anthony Griffiths from Plain Engineering. I'm just wondering, I hear from all the speakers up there, you all have your operations in fairly remote areas and inhospitable locations. I'm just wondering if you see the mine of the future somewhat like oil and gas and eventually going offshore. Thanks.
Quite possible. I mean, we've seen, here's the challenge, and I'm just going to talk to the gold side. Last year we saw a 17% drop in reserves across the board. There literally hasn't been a new gold discovery of any magnitude in the last 5 years. And in order for companies to keep their production rates at current levels, the amount of money that's going to need to be invested is huge. The markets right now aren't supporting much in terms of equity. It's a dead zone. It's very much focused on cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, technology. Trying to get somebody excited about mining right now is a real challenge. And so I think there will come a point where there will be such a depletion in resources, we'll see an uplift again, and there will be an opportunity to raise money, and there may be, to your point, the need to go offshore and look for new resources, because as grades have fallen dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years, and the costs have moved up, there will be people looking for new resources offshore, my opinion.
My only comment would be you'll go where the resources are, and so for example, right now, great emphasis on looking for lithium, so we're looking at very different kinds of deposit types, brines, and as well as clays and things. So I think it's simple. Where's lowest cost producer is going to get the money.
I think it all just becomes a matter of costs and risks. Another example would be in the wind industry. Initially, wind turbines were all onshore. Now, especially in Europe, we're seeing a lot of offshore wind turbines because the technology is there, the risk is low, and the costs are good.
Got this down, we'll go right down the road. I know there's diamond mining that happens offshore. I haven't heard anything regarding gold mining. I know that the ore body that's in West Africa does go into the Atlantic. But everything that I hear from the Met guys is about making the current process more efficient and trying to work more efficiently with lower grades.
I think I've heard of a uranium mine in Saskatchewan, actually, that's drilling under a lake as well. Well, I think that concludes our session. Give a round of applause for our panelists.